There is a valley in Central Asia where the ground is littered with broken banners. Greek banners, Mongol banners, British, Soviet, American. 5 of the most powerful empires in human history marched into these mountains at the height of their power, and every single one of them crawled back out. They call it the graveyard of empires. But that name hides a question almost nobody can answer. How? How does a poor, landlocked mountain country with no navy, no industry, and no unified army defeat everyone? Tonight, I'm going to show you 2,000 years of Afghanistan's secret history, and I promise you, the answer is not what you think. To understand Afghanistan, forget about people for a moment. Look at the land. The Hindu Kush is a wall of rock and ice, 600 miles long, with peaks higher than anything in Europe. Armies don't march through this land. They squeeze through it, one man at a time. And the land fights back. Mountain passes so narrow a dozen defenders can hold off thousands. Winters that bury entire columns in snow. Summers that melt them. Air so thin that lowland soldiers collapse just walking uphill. And beneath it all, a hidden world of caves where the defenders can vanish like smoke. But here's the real secret. Afghanistan was never one country to conquer. It's 1,000 tiny worlds, isolated valleys, each with its own tribe, its own chief, its own rules. You can capture the capital. You can crown your own king. It changes nothing. There is no single head to cut off. An empire that invades Afghanistan isn't fighting one war. It's fighting 1,000 small wars, all at once. The first man to learn this lesson was the greatest conqueror who ever lived. 330 years before Christ, Alexander the Great. Undefeated. He has crushed the mightiest empire on earth, and he's still in his 20s. His army has never lost a battle. And then, he reaches the mountains. His legendary phalanx, a perfect killing machine on open ground, becomes a helpless crowd in the mountain passes, and the enemy refuses to fight like civilized armies. They strike at night, steal his supplies, and vanish into the cliffs. For the first time in his life, Alexander is fighting an enemy he cannot see. It all comes down to a fortress on top of a sheer cliff, so high the defenders laughed at him. "Find soldiers with wings," they shouted down. So Alexander offered a fortune to any man who could climb. 300 volunteers scaled the ice wall at night with nothing but ropes and tent pegs. At dawn, the defenders looked up and saw Greek soldiers standing above them. But here's what the legends don't tell you. Even after that victory, Alexander couldn't hold the land. It cost him more men than the entire conquest of Persia. In the end, the greatest conqueror in history didn't break Afghanistan. He married it, taking a local princess, Roxana, as his wife and marching away. His golden helmet gathered dust in the passes. The mountains didn't even notice. Then, for centuries, something remarkable happened. Peace. Afghanistan sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, where the Silk Road tied China, India, Persia, and Rome into a single golden knot. Caravans of silk and spices flowed through the passes, and in one valley, craftsmen carved 2 colossal Buddhas into a golden cliff, among the tallest statues on earth. Monasteries hummed in the mountains. Scholars filled libraries with knowledge from every civilization. This wasn't a backwater. This was one of the richest, most connected places on the planet. But far to the east, a storm was gathering, and this storm had a name that still makes historians shiver. In the year 1221, a terrified messenger galloped into the bazaars with impossible news. An ocean of horsemen was coming. 100,000 riders who moved faster than the news of their arrival. The Golden Age had exactly 1 year left to live. Genghis Khan didn't actually want to invade. He sent a trade caravan and ambassadors. The local ruler stole the goods, shaved the ambassadors' beards, and sent them home humiliated. Historians agree. It was the single worst decision in the history of the medieval world. What came next wasn't a conquest. It was an erasure. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were not captured. They were deleted. At the city of Bamiyan, where the Khan's favorite grandson was killed by an arrow, Genghis ordered that nothing be left alive. Then he had the ruins plowed into farmland, removing the city from the map itself. But look up. High above the burning valleys, in caves no horseman could reach, people survived. The mountains sheltered them, as they always had. And within a few generations, something strange happened. The Mongols who stayed became Afghans. Their descendants, the Hazara, live in those same valleys today. The empire didn't absorb Afghanistan. Afghanistan absorbed the empire. Fast forward 600 years. 1839. The British Empire, the largest empire in human history, controls a quarter of the planet. On the map of Asia, one mountain-shaped hole remains unpainted. To the north, Russia is creeping south. The two giants begin a shadow war called the Great Game, and Afghanistan is the chessboard. The British march in, install a puppet king, and settle down to colonial life. Gardens, tea parties, even croquet in Kabul. They are so confident, they send half the army home. They never ask themselves one simple question. Why is it so quiet? In November 1841, Kabul explodes. What follows is the most infamous retreat in British history. 16,500 soldiers, families, and servants march out of Kabul into the January snow, heading for Jalalabad, 90 miles away, through a gauntlet of mountain passes. The tribes are waiting on every cliff. Day by day, the column melts like a line of candles in the wind. 1 week later, sentries at Jalalabad spot a single rider on a dying horse. Dr. William Bryden, an army surgeon, part of his skull sheared away. They asked him, "Where is the army?" He answered, "I am the army." 1 man out of 16,000. When the news reached London, the empire on which the sun never set went silent. Britain returned for revenge, burned the Great Bazaar of Kabul, and then left the same year. They tried again 40 years later. Same result. In the end, all the empire had to show for it was a line. A border drawn with a ruler by a British bureaucrat, slicing straight through tribes and families. A line that still causes wars today. Empire number 3, broken. Christmas Eve, 1979. A river of Soviet steel pours through the passes. Tanks, helicopters, 100,000 men. This time it's different. This time the invader has gunships that fly, armor that shrugs off bullets, and an air force the tribes can't even scratch. On paper, the war should last weeks. The old men in the villages just watched the tanks roll past and shook their heads. Because the mountains don't care about technology. The fighters simply went underground, into the same cave networks their ancestors used against Alexander. The mighty gunships circled over empty rocks. And then, in 1986, everything changed. A missile you could carry on your shoulder. Suddenly, one shepherd on a ridge could erase $1 million helicopter with a single line of light. The hunters became the hunted. 10 years, 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, billions drained from an economy already cracking. Soviet mothers began asking questions the government couldn't answer. In February 1989, the last Soviet general walked back across the border bridge and never looked back. A boy stood by that road, watching the last tank leave, holding his father's hat, victorious in a land of ruins. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself shattered into 15 pieces. Think about that. The superpower didn't just lose the war, it stopped existing. And the mountains? The mountains hadn't changed at all. But this time, victory turned into tragedy. The liberators turned their guns on each other. A decade of civil war and darkness followed. Kites banned, music banned, history itself dynamited. And then, one blue September morning, on the other side of the world, 2 shadows crossed the sky, and everything changed again. October 2001. The most powerful military in human history arrives. Stealth jets, drones, satellites that can read a license plate from space. A space-age armada against the same rocks that broke Alexander. Over 20 years, America would pour more than $2 trillion into these mountains. Adjusted for scale, more than the Marshall Plan that rebuilt all of Europe. and the coins just vanished into the cracks. The war became a carnival game no one could win. Clear a valley. The fighters melt into the hills. Leave. They flow back like water. Meanwhile, an American soldier shares tea with a village elder whose grandfather fought the British and whose ancestor watched Alexander pass. For the locals, this wasn't a new war. It was just the next empire. Some American soldiers finished their tours, went home, raised children, and then their children deployed to the same valleys. And then, in August 2021, it simply ended. Not with a final battle, with a switch being turned off. The world watched one airport become the last door out of a 20-year war. On August 30th, 1 minute before midnight, the last American general walked up the ramp of the last cargo plane. Empire number 5. The shelf is full. So now you know the story. But what's the real answer? Why could no one conquer this place? Reason 1. The land itself is a fortress. Every valley a wall, every winter a siege. Reason 2. There is no head to cut off. Capture the capital, and you've captured nothing but a city. Reason 3. Time. Every invader is on a clock, counting coins, counting votes, counting bodies. The Afghans are home. They count. Nothing. As the saying goes, you have the watches. We have the time. And reason 4, the deepest one. No empire was ever actually defeated by Afghanistan. They defeated themselves. They all arrived strong and bled themselves weak, fighting a place that simply refused to become anything other than what it was. The Greeks called these mountains impossible. The British called them cursed. The Soviets called them a wound. The Americans called them the forever war. The Afghans just call them home. Empires rise, conquer the world, and shatter against these rocks. And when the dust settles, a shepherd walks his flock over the same passes his ancestor walked when Alexander came, standing exactly where his people have always stood. 2,000 years, 5 empires, same mountains. The graveyard of empires keeps its collection and waits. But here's a question for you. If the strongest empires in history couldn't conquer these mountains, what about the one force that conquers everything? That story is next. If you want to see it, subscribe. The mountains have time. So do we.